They say royalty doesn't cry, that behind palace gates, emotion is rehearsed, filtered, and folded neatly into silence. But on one quiet evening, away from flashing cameras and scripted speeches, something unthinkable happened. In a room not meant for public eyes, a future king knelt before someone the world barely knows. His own daughter, and for the first time, stripped of duty, stripped of image, he broke. There were no advisors, no bodyguards, no titles, just a father and a child. Her tiny hand reached up to his tear-stained cheek, confused by his silence, unaware of the weight he carried. And that's when he whispered it. A promise, so full of hope, love, and desperation. It could break a nation's heart. No matter what crown they place on me, you will always come first. I promise. Words not meant for history books. Words not meant for anyone but her. And yet, here we are. Because something happened. Something that not only shook the walls of the royal estate, but left that promise hanging by a thread. At first, it was only rumors, whispers in corridors, hushed voices in parliament, a shift in the line of succession, a clash between royal tradition and a father's vow. But then, silence. No public statements, no photos, no explanations, just William, colder in public, distant in interviews, eyes searching but never finding. And somewhere, a little girl wondering why her father now looks at the crown like it's a curse. What did he see that night? What did he know when he made that promise? And why does it feel like he's about to break it? Because behind every royal wave and carefully curated smile, something is unraveling, and those close to the family are beginning to talk. They say his loyalty is being tested, not to the crown, but to his own blood. And the question that's now echoing across the internet is this: can a future king keep a promise if keeping it means breaking tradition? This isn't just about royalty anymore. This is about every father who's ever stood between duty and love, and every child who believed their parent could protect them from anything. Before we go any further, remember what you're about to discover has never been addressed publicly. It's been buried in silence, masked by protocol, and sealed behind palace doors, until now. This story might break hearts, it might spark outrage, but one thing is certain: it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about him. And as for the promise he made, the clock is ticking. At first, no one noticed the change. After all, in the royal world, silence is survival. Smiles are currency, but for those who paid attention, those who looked closer, something in his eyes had dimmed. The warmth that once flickered when he looked at his daughter had cooled. The way he used to bend down just to hear her laugh, just to kiss her hair, now felt like memories caught in fog. He wasn't avoiding her, he was protecting her. At least, that's what he told himself. Behind closed doors, the pressure had reached a boil. Royal advisors, senior officials, even family, all reminding him of what must be done. A ceremonial decision was approaching, one that would shape tradition, lineage, and headlines for decades. But it came with a cost that no one but him fully understood. Because in that decision was a choice. One path honored the ancient weight of monarchy. The other, it honored a whispered promise to a little girl who looked at him like he was her entire world. But tradition doesn't bend, and the monarchy doesn't forget. Word came down through formal channels. A document signed, sealed, and delivered. A title once assumed to be his daughter's birthright would be passed to another, quietly, without announcement, without even a warning. He held that letter in trembling hands, alone in his private study. No cameras, no press, just the echo of his own heartbeat, and the sound of that moment breaking him from the inside. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. That's not how royalty works. Instead, he sat in silence, a silence so thick, even the air seemed to mourn. He looked out the window where his daughter played in the garden below, innocent, free, unaware that something had been taken from her before she ever had the chance to understand it. His hands clenched, not in anger, but in helplessness. For a man raised to follow duty, who gave everything to be the perfect heir, This was the first time he realized the crown didn't protect his family, it demanded their sacrifice. And what haunted him most wasn't the stolen title, it was the look she would give him the day she asked, "Why didn't you fight for me?" Because he had promised her everything. And now, with the stroke of a pen, he had already failed. He wanted to tear the paper into. He wanted to walk into that garden, lift her in his arms, and tell her none of it mattered. But the world was watching, and kings don't run. The night the letter arrived, he barely slept. The corridors of the palace, always so still after dark, now felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of memories that wouldn't let go. Long before the promise, long before fatherhood, there was another boy in the palace, a boy who also had questions, and no one brave enough to answer them. He remembered that hallway, cold, echoing, endless. He had walked it dozens of times. As a child in a starched suit, his tiny hands swallowed by the grip of a nanny or a guard. Every step was measured, every smile practiced. But even then he understood, appearances were everything. He remembered asking once after a public appearance why his mother had tears in her eyes behind her sunglasses. They told him, "She's tired, that's all." But he knew better. Even then, he recognized sadness disguised as strength. He remembered the way she used to hug him, fiercely, as if trying to protect him from something invisible. And then, how suddenly, the hugs were gone. They told him to keep going, to smile for the cameras. So he did. He became the boy the world expected. The royal prototype, the heir. He learned to lower his head when walking into a room. He learned to wave just right. Not too fast, not too stiff. He learned how to speak, without saying anything real. But inside, he was screaming. Years later, the echoes of that scream still lived in him, quietly tucked behind his public persona. He had mastered the art of controlled grief, the ability to feel deeply, and show nothing. It was a skill passed down like a family heirloom. But then, his daughter was born, and suddenly, everything cracked. The first time he held her, his hands trembled, not from nerves, but from fear. The same fear his mother must have felt. The fear of what the world does to soft hearts in hard systems. She looked at him with those unblinking eyes, innocent, trusting, untouched by the weight of crowns or expectations. And in that fragile, perfect moment, he swore to himself, "She will never feel what I felt. I will be the father mine couldn't be." That vow lived in everything he did. From the stories he read her at night, to the way he crouched down to her level and really listened. He gave her what no one had given him. Presence. Real, human, vulnerable presence. But now, that promise felt like it was cracking under the same pressure that broke him as a boy. He had spent his whole life learning how to shut down emotion to survive. Now he was expected to pass on that same survival to her. To tell her to smile, even when she's breaking. To accept that duty comes before dreams. That royalty comes before reality. It tore at him, every second. He'd sit in meetings with advisors, discussing legacy and bloodlines. But in his mind he heard her giggling in the garden, asking if they could have a picnic instead of going to another event. He wanted to say yes, every time, but instead he smiled and said, "Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow rarely came. And now, as he stood at the crossroads, caught between the father he longed to be, and the heir he was trained to become, those flashbacks weren't just memories. They were warnings, because he knew what it meant to be raised by an institution. He knew what it meant to never quite belong to yourself. He remembered the cameras at his school gates, the reporters shouting his name, the way he learned to laugh on command, to hide behind polite answers, while his heart begged for someone, anyone, to ask how he really felt. No one ever did, and now he feared history was ready to repeat itself. Not as tragedy, but as tradition. He stared into the mirror one morning, the crown looming in his future, and whispered the question he hadn't dared speak aloud. Am I becoming the very thing I swore to protect her from? Because hiding pain was a skill, he had it mastered. But teaching that skill to his daughter, that would be the ultimate betrayal. Once their bond had been unshakable. Every morning began with her small footsteps racing down the hallway, flinging open the study doors, climbing into his lap while he read the morning briefings. She didn't care about royal protocol. She didn't care that he was a prince. To her he was just Dad, the one who braided her hair, the one who danced with her in socks on marble floors, the one who promised the world could be soft, even inside stone walls. But lately, she had stopped running to him. At first he told himself she was just growing up, that children drift naturally, but deep down he knew better. Children are mirrors, and what she saw in him now, the tension in his jaw, the distracted eyes, the forced smiles, was not the man who once lifted her up like she was light itself. She asked fewer questions. She laughed less when he entered the room, and one evening when he tried to tuck her in, she quietly whispered, "Will you be gone again tomorrow?" It hit harder than any headline ever could. The distance wasn't loud, it was quiet, and that's what made it unbearable. No slamming doors, no arguments, just silent, delicate, heartbreaking silence. He had promised to shield her, to be the parent she could always run to. But now he was becoming the man she tiptoed around, because she could feel it. The change, the pressure, the weight he carried but never spoke of. And it wasn't just her. Even with his partner, once his strongest confidant, things had shifted. Conversations were shorter, glances lingered longer, searching for words that wouldn't come. Every decision about duty felt like a negotiation, every family moment shadowed by the unspoken truth. He was being pulled away, inch by inch, by a system that never asked what it would cost. He sat across the dinner table one night, watching her eat in silence. No jokes, no giggles, just routine. And for a man raised in tradition, it wasn't the ceremonies or the crown that haunted him most. It was that look in her eyes, the quiet fading of warmth, as if she was already learning to live without parts of him. A space had formed between them, not wide, not final, but growing. And he feared that if he didn't act soon, he wouldn't just lose a title. He'd lose the one thing more sacred than any crown, her trust. Every day began the same. A schedule prepared down to the second. A suit tailored to perfection, and a smile rehearsed more than felt. On paper his life was carved from prestige. Appearances, ceremonies, meetings, portraits, all curated for the public eye. But behind that gleaming image, something far more brutal was eating away at him. Because in royalty, every movement is watched. Every pause, every breath, every flicker of expression becomes a headline. The moment he hesitated before a royal handshake, tabloids called him distant. When he held his daughter's hand too long in public, they said he was overly emotional. And when he tried, just once, to skip a formal event to stay home while she was sick, the palace issued a statement without him even knowing. The crown doesn't care about compassion, it cares about continuity. He used to believe he could balance it. Father and future king, protector and public figure. But the deeper he walked into the machinery of monarchy, the more he realized, it doesn't share, it consumes. It demands that your grief be quiet, that your joy be filtered, that your opinions be erased, that even your love must be staged, for the right moment, and only when the cameras say it's safe. Behind those palace doors he began to feel like a ghost, moving from one responsibility to the next, his real self dissolving under the weight of what the world expected him to be. He remembered standing on the palace balcony one day, waving at thousands below, cheers, flags, celebration, and yet all he could think was, none of these people know who I am. His daughter had once asked him, do they cheer because they know you?
He had smiled then, but inside the answer crushed him. No, my love. They cheer because they know the role, and the truth is, he was starting to forget the difference. Every time he tried to draw a line between duty and family, it blurred. He was told not to speak publicly about his child's struggles. It might take unprofessional. He was asked to avoid certain schools or parks because it sent the wrong message. Every choice that might protect her was weighed against optics, and with every compromise, a piece of him cracked. But it was the way people looked at him that hurt the most. Not with admiration, not with understanding, but with expectation. Like he owed them something. Like he wasn't a man anymore. Just a symbol in a suit. Even those closest to him, advisors he had trusted for years, began speaking to him differently. Think of your image. Think of the crown. Never once. Think of her. He had once thought the crown was heavy because of responsibility, but now he realized it was heavy because it crushed anything human beneath it. And perhaps the cruelest part of all, the world didn't see him unraveling. They saw poise, prestige, power. But inside, he was drowning in silence. And the question that haunted him most wasn't will I endure, it was how much of me will be left if I do. When the world grew too loud, she was the only one who never asked him to speak. No grand gestures. No advice masked as orders. Just present. Her comfort didn't arrive with words, but with timing, like how she always seemed to walk into the room the moment his hands trembled after a call with the palace, or how she'd place a cup of tea by his side without a word, and sit, not to talk, but to remind him he wasn't alone. She never asked about the headlines, never asked about the whispers in the halls. She only asked once, "Do you still know who you are?" That question lingered in his chest for days, because honestly, he wasn't sure. But she didn't push. She didn't try to fix him. She just stayed. In a life governed by protocols and pages of speaking notes, her silence was his sanctuary. With her he could fall apart, not in pieces but in pauses, a glance, a soft breath, a touch on his shoulder when he stared too long at nothing. She was the only one who didn't expect him to be anything but himself, stripped of titles, unarmored by expectation. And when the weight became too much, when he locked himself in the study and pressed his forehead against cold glass, it was her hand that gently rested on his back, grounding him. Sometimes she would hum, not loud, not meant for anyone else to hear, just enough to fill the room with something that wasn't pressure. He told himself once that she saved him in those moments. But the truth was, she didn't save him. She simply reminded him he was worth saving. And when he watched their daughter run into her arms, laughing, eyes lit with that same quiet strength, he realized something. He wasn't the only one being held together by this silent anchor. His daughter felt it too. There, in that stillness, in that quiet loyalty that never asked for recognition, was the love that royalty rarely knew. Unconditional, unseen, but unshakable. She was his shelter from the storm, and though the world never saw her crown, there comes a moment in every legacy where tradition becomes a question mark, where a son must ask if the footsteps he's meant to follow still lead anywhere worth going. He had always believed in duty. That was drilled into him since the cradle. Stand straight, smile warmly, never show fear, sacrifice the personal for the national. But what no one warned him about was the slow erosion of soul that came from constantly being what others expected. And now, with his daughter watching him more closely than the public ever could, the stakes were different. Because he wasn't just raising a future citizen, he was shaping a future woman. One who would learn love from the way he held her mother's hand in private. One who would learn courage from the battles he chose to fight, and the ones he refused to play along with. And perhaps most painfully, she would learn silence from what he didn't say. He found himself wondering, what would she believe was normal? To watch someone she loved break under invisible weight. To see tears swallowed for the sake of appearance. To accept that no one speaks about pain when the cameras are rolling. He didn't want that to be her inheritance. He had always told himself, one day I'll fix it. But one day never comes in the palace. There's always another event, another obligation, another reason to wait. But what if the only way to protect her was to become the disruption? Not for the tabloids, not for rebellion, but because legacy doesn't just live in bloodlines. It lives in the choices passed down like whispered instructions. He began to see it clearly now. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to preserve image over humanity. But maybe that design no longer fit the world his daughter would grow into. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to change the crown, instead of carrying it. That thought terrified him, because it meant stepping off the path. It meant risking everything he'd been trained to uphold. But it also meant freeing the next generation from the invisible shackles he wore every day. He thought back to the promise he made to her, that he'd always protect her. At the time he thought that meant shielding her from scandal, from criticism, from public glare. But now he knew it meant protecting her from becoming another silent royal, trained to bury her heart beneath a smile. So he started asking different questions. What does leadership look like with honesty? What if strength included vulnerability? What if duty didn't mean erasing yourself, but revealing the truth, even when it shakes the walls? The old guard might not understand. The world might call it reckless. But he was no longer leading for them. He was leading for the little girl who once danced in the hallway, believing her father could move mountains. Now he was ready to move one. Not for tradition, but for transformation. In the stillness of night, long after the palace lights had dimmed and the weight of another public day had been hung neatly alongside his tailored coat, he stood in the doorway of her bedroom. She was asleep, one arm wrapped tightly around a worn stuffed animal, the other stretched across the pillow where he'd once sat. Every evening, telling her stories about kings and heroes who always made the right choice. Back then she believed those stories. Back then maybe he did too. But now, the stories had changed. And so had he. Outside that room, the world saw tradition, legacy, a symbol of continuity. But inside these four quiet walls, he saw what the world often forgets. A child who didn't care about crowns, titles or centuries of protocol. A child who needed her father more than her father needed to be perfect. And that right there was the truth that pierced deeper than any royal obligation ever could. Because while the world watched him wave, shake hands, and walk red carpets, she was watching something else entirely. She was watching who he became when the cameras turned away. Would he be the man who stayed silent for the sake of the institution? Or the man who finally spoke for the sake of her future? The decision wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the legacy she would carry. Would she grow up believing love must always be sacrificed for responsibility? That emotions must be hidden to appear strong? That silence was safer than truth? He had spent years mastering the art of being composed, controlled, calculated, and yet in that moment, watching her chest rise and fall beneath a soft pink blanket, he realized the bravest thing he could ever do was let the world see his heart. Because if he stayed silent, what message would it send her? That royalty meant suffering in silence. That power was earned by surrendering your soul. That dignity meant never shedding tears, even when the cost was losing the people who mattered most. He stepped closer to her bed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She stirred slightly, and for a moment her hand reached out in sleep, instinctively searching, hoping for presence. He let her fingers wrap around him, and he promised himself again. Not out loud, not to the world, but in the quiet vow only a parent can understand. I won't let them shape you into something you're not. I won't let you believe that love has to hide. But here's where the story turns to you, the view, because this isn't just about a prince and his daughter. This is about us. All of us who've been told to choose duty over emotion, who've been taught to smile through pain, to serve others, while starving our own hearts. It's about the fathers too afraid to cry, the daughters too used to being overlooked, the partners who sit in silence, hoping to be seen beneath the noise. What does it mean to break a generational pattern? When that pattern wears a crown, can someone born into a role that demands silence become the voice that changes everything? And here's the question no headline ever dares to ask. What would you choose if the world expected you to be perfect, but your child just needed you to be real? Would you uphold a tradition that's broken countless hearts before yours? Or would you risk everything to be the one who breaks the silence? In the end, maybe the most radical act in royalty isn't rebellion. It's humanity. And perhaps the most powerful thing a father can do is kneel down, look into his daughter's eyes and say, I choose, even if it means changing everything they told me I had to be. So now the question is yours to carry. If you were handed a crown that came with chains, would you wear it? Or would you forge a new path, so your children never have to? In a palace built on silence, one promise echoed louder than any royal decree. Not to a nation, not to a crown, but to a daughter asleep, unaware yet powerful enough to change everything. He may have been born into duty, but now he's waking up for love. And maybe, just maybe, the history books won't remember the throne he inherited, but the chain he broke for her. What would you choose if your legacy was watching you, with her eyes wide open?